Greetings. My name is Jace Hargis, and I was asked by a good colleague of mine, Dr. Shi, to share some information with her students. And so I thought I would go ahead and record kind of a screencast here where you can kind of hear me and listen to what I have to say about some of these and the research behind two of the main topics. The first one is going to be how we process information, and the second video will be self-regulated learning. These two videos will be about 15 minutes. Feel free to view, pause them. There's a few activities that if you'd like to engage in, or just slow down and read some of the material a little more carefully, but I will try to go through this pretty quickly. With that, let's go ahead and start it up. I'll go ahead and share my screen, open up the first session here and present. I'll begin to present this. The whole point here is these really are some topics that might be, really should be of interest throughout your life, throughout your career. And I think that you'll find that how we process information is really a significant portion of what we should do in the classroom, outside the classroom, and in our jobs. And so I do hope that you can kind of think about how you might connect these concepts every time that I speak of each of these. First of all, I always like to kind of share here the things that I hope to address. When I say IP, it's the kind of the information processing model. So I'll not to use much jargon, but IP would be information processing, how our brain processes information. So I'm going to basically share with you a bit of how that occurs, some of the models, a main model that's out there, what motivates us, a few activities that you might want to engage in to try to help yourself process information a little more deeply. And then I'll leave you with a diagnostic that might be helpful when you think about how well you might be processing information. So the first I always like to do is this might be a concept that you're not really familiar with. So I just like you to take a second. You can pause the video, or you can just think to yourself out loud. You can write it down, whatever it is. But what are some of the things, some of the words, maybe some of the ideas that come to mind when you even hear the word information processing? You probably heard of these terms individually. You know what information is, and you know what processing is. But this is something else that might be new when you take these two together. So I'd like for you to think about this, and then we'll talk about it. And then I'll ask you again at the very end to reflect upon those terms and see if there's any kind of new concepts that might come to mind. The first step is, it's really kind of anatomically, biologically, is that this is how we process information physically. Some research 2015 just basically reinforces what many of you might already know. Is that basically our brain is full of these neurons, and neurons basically through some of the chemistry in our brain allow information, pockets of information to be transferred through these concepts of these items of synapses. So it's the space between those and allows them to send information. So the concept here would be the more the better, right? The more neurons you have, the faster the speed of the synapses that take place would be helpful at helping us more completely and quickly process information. The second portion of this is obviously how can we help that out? How can we encourage these neuron growths? And you can actually do it through a combination of diet and exercise, which is helpful almost with all of our approaches to life and to learning. Things like blueberries, and I will say dark chocolate. I want to remind people that the term dark chocolate here means a high percentage of the cacao inside of that chocolate. Other foods like any foods with omega-3 fatty acids, green tea, and obviously exercise will help stimulate what's called this brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which again helps us all with this concept of growing our neurons. A few other things that we can do, we all need to be recharged and think about what we can do with this. Is sure, if you play a video game on a factor of 10, kind of looking at these in a norm reference way, that might help recharge the brain a little bit. Reading might help a little bit, getting a little bit of exercise. But the bottom line is the big ones that are going to help is some sort of exercise. And oddly enough, some sort of exercise in a green or a natural space. This will help recharge your brain and your neurons more quickly, more deeply. And so you might think about that when you're getting tired, or somehow when you're doing some studying or having conversations and things quite aren't clicking as you'd like them to, is to do some of this. How do we process this? These are some three really key aspects that Shok came up with. Is basically we're able to see and notice this processing ability through some sort of a behavioral change or a change in how we might be able to. So the capacity or the potential for a changed behavior. And that behavior could be how we might improve upon a skill, a conversation skill, a critical thinking skill, a physical skill. It should change and it should hang around over time. This you'll find in the research very often, a big difference between cramming for a test and learning deeply through some sort of a project hands-on experience. Most of the time, those types of hands-on experiences will be with you years later. You can, again, hopefully you're thinking, you're hearing this, and there's a few connections you might be thinking about. Oh, when I was young, I did this and I still remember, or when I was in secondary school, I can still do this skill, or I can still work in this way. So those happen because they really were truly processed deeply within your schema. And lastly, it typically occurs through some sort of experience. Again, this is why we have experiential learning. This is why we have internships and co-ops, and we have these kind of practicing that you do, because we really want that experience to be processed well. I would like you to take a second to kind of think about this, because we do have some gradations of how we process. And so the first thing is I'd like you to think about, kind of part of that last slide, maybe it started you to think about the times and moments, concepts, ideas, when you learned and you felt like you were really processing something well. It could have been yesterday, it could have been a year ago, it could have been when you were 5 years of age. Think about what that is, where it was, and what was the context, what was going on that made you really learn that well. Again, feel free to pause the video, think about that, discuss with somebody, write that down, whatever makes you feel like it helps you understand this. The opposite of that, think about when you were doing something young or old, and it just blocked your processing. It was difficult. You couldn't actually accomplish it. And there was this real wall that you hit cognitively, mentally, that you weren't able to accomplish that. Well, what was going on in those cases? Chances are those were kind of sterile environments. Often they happen in formal education, where we have these walls and fluorescent lights and a time schedule that we're on. And so these are things to show that human processing doesn't really occur the best that way. It occurs more in what we call informal settings, natural settings, just-in-time settings. And so you might think about that when you really need to learn something well, is to create those kind of environments for yourself. How do we make these complex decisions? So there's day-to-day decisions, and then there's these complex decisions. Obviously, you probably have heard a bit, and you can certainly look up more on brain research on the brain has this frontal lobe, and things happen, and we have stimuli and information. But I thought this was really interesting on connecting it to processing, is that it basically, it computes what's this kind of a confidence of how certain are we of a decision with a bunch of experience. You know, we're probably more certain with less experience. And then it kind of gauges that potential for failure. Natural human brains actually embrace failure. They see failed events and they see this opportunity to learn from something that you didn't know. And then they start to collect that data and use that data for subsequent decisions. Kind of novice learners and maybe folks that are a little more apprehensive avoid that fear, avoid that failure. And they really miss upon a lot of these opportunities to use those, what I call failed events, to help them out. And then they basically, your brain uses those to gain more and more confidence. And so think about that when maybe you don't know something or the first time, is that actually, you want to try to continue to kind of move along those ways and kind of persist. The main information processing model, also called the dual memory model by Atkinson and Schifrin in 1971, really has this simple formation. There's much more to this. If you're interested in this, I recommend highly that you go out and do a bit of research, because this is really key on how we, whether we like it or not, how we process information. We have an input. I'm hoping that I am a major input right now, and you're not thinking and looking at other things, and you're sensing the kind of things that I'm saying and the kind of pictures that you're seeing and you're kind of reading. And that naturally kind of goes into what's called your STM, which is your short-term memory, commonly known as your working memory. Tons and tons of ideas and stimuli flood our short-term memory. And so we in the human brain has to do something with this. Typically 5 to 7 seconds, we're making sense of this. And here's this little connection of human action between short-term and long-term. We make a decision based on what we think is important, what we value, maybe our prior experiences. We make that decision and we either believe that it's something that we might need, and so therefore we'll place it over into LTM, so short-term memory, into long-term memory. And it'll be there for subsequent recall based upon what kind of further stimuli or coding that happens within that memory transformation. You might start to think about, well, how do you remember things well? How can you apply things well? Well, obviously, at some point in your life, it really could have been very young, or it could have been yesterday. Something happened that ensured that information was placed into long-term memory, LTM, which it'll be there then for the future. A couple things to think about. There are some really simple and straightforward ways. Things like mnemonic devices and chunking and a thing called serial positioning. This will help us process that information. And then the more advanced kind of tools like self-regulation, metacognition, and self-efficacy, which I'll be discussing in detail in the next video. Really quickly, these are some activities just to reinforce this concept of information processing. If you can, and you may want to pause the video and take a look at this, but just take a moment and count the number of F's that you see in this passage. Normally, I would wait a few minutes. Again, feel free to pause it. Now, some of you may have come up with all 6, and others may have only come up with 3. It's very, very common. This is not a diagnostic. This is not a cognitive test. This does not tell whether you are smart. It's not even an eye test. It simply is a way to reinforce the fact that our brains will process information. If English is your first language, you might view this one way. If English is your second language, you might view it another way. But often, many of us overlook the F in the of. It's a short word. We hear it as a V if we're talking kind of in our minds. And so this is just a really interesting way that we do process information, and for us to double check that we don't always perceive and process it accurately and completely the first time that we do it. Another way is physically. We actually are processing information physically. So this is a little quick exercise. Again, you can pause the video here and you can do this, but while sitting down, raise your right foot and make these little clockwise circles. At the same time, take your finger up in the air and draw the number 6 in your hand and observe what happens to your foot. For most of us, there'll be some interesting things that are happening. Our hand and feet were doing different things. And so our brains are taking the information and movements and processing that a little bit differently. And finally, one other perception processing is kind of fun to think about is that here's a big picture of a lot of coffee beans. I'd like you just to, you can again, pause the video if you'd like, but take a few seconds to minutes and find the man's head that's located within here. And once you receive that, you're done. It's basically just trying to locate that, but there are some strategies for these. You can pause, and I'll move ahead. If you found it super quick in 3 seconds, it's down there at the bottom. Bottom left, you can see there's a little head poking through. If you found it in 40 to 20, it's normal. If you're still looking, there it is. Some of us take a long time because we take a different procedure. It took me longer time. I tend to be, as a chemist, I'm analytical. I started from the upper left and I kind of went across the top and down and down. Other people look at things holistically. And so we don't all process information visually the same way. So these are things to think about for yourselves, for colleagues, when you're having a communication or a conversation, or you're working on a project, which many of you will do during your schooling, but also you will do when you secure a position in life. Memory degrades very quickly. A little reminder that we think that we can remember some things, but pretty much after 20, 30 minutes, and most of our classes are an hour, we've lost half of what we think that we remembered, unless there's some mechanisms to help process that more deeply. And so if you think you can, and people try to hold it in that short-term memory, that's what cramming for a test is all about. We do recommend that you find alternative ways to actually process that into long-term memory. So it's there, hopefully for the future, when you get a job, you can use that information. Some people always are curious about what motivates some people to process information more deeply. Daniel Pink, a fairly famous author, comes up with 3, which I think are just really quite interesting ideas that you might think about if you possess these, which is purpose, autonomy, and mastery. These are some things that help us intrinsically or internally if we have these, if we believe there's a purpose, if we have some self kind of sufficiency, autonomy. And if we really want to master that, these are some things that if we're allowed to do those things, that we tend to actually process information more deeply. If you'd like, again, pause this. I can share any of this information with you, but you can go out and look for his video. He's got a really nice, about a 12-minute video that explains each of one of these in detail. In addition, there are some ways, there's some strategies that can help you activate this deep, sustained processing. I've got a list of 288 strategies. I'm happy to share that with you. Here's a subset of those. The first one basically being after you do something to process that, to really reflect upon it. This could be microseconds to seconds to minutes. But think about reflecting upon that. And that's this kind of metacognitive thing about, what did I hear? What did I do? How can I use that? And that's going to help that process it and place that inside of your long-term memory. I think Fair Share allows you to verbalize. And we all know that by listening and verbalizing and writing down some things will also help kind of cement that ideas inside of your schema. Concept mapping, anytime you want to think about making connections, one connection to the next, you can kind of track and backtrack these ideas. And then lastly, there's one called creating a commercial, which takes a lot of information and boils it down into this concise 1 or 2 line commercial. And that's called a synthetic or synthesizing information. And that helps you pack and unpack these ideas. So how do you process this? The last thing I promised you was a kind of a quasi-diagnostic. There's one called the social style theory that I learned when I was working for an engineering firm. And they kind of focus on 2 major scales, assertiveness and responsiveness. I'll basically show these 2 with you. There are 2 slides. The first one is going to be this one. I recommend that you pause the video at this point, answer these questions. You simply are going to be placing kind of a checkbox or a number in each of these. So the first one, as you view yourself as a learner or as processing information, are you typically highly cooperative? If so, then you'll put a 1 down. If you're highly competitive, you'll place a 6 down. Or if you're someplace in between, you'll write a 2, 3, or 4. Do each one of these and add that total up. Again, you may want to pause the video here, complete that. And we'll do this one more time. Different scale, responsiveness, same approach. When you think about how you process information, are you more open? That's a 1, 6, guarded, right on down. Place that score into the bottom there, into the red. Now with those 2 scores, again, you may want to pause the video. With those 2 scores, we're going to plot those 2 very simply into an XY axis. When you're done with those and you have your 2 scores and you're ready to move on and you turn the video back on, you'll derive this particular spreadsheet, this grid. In this grid, you'll take the first number that you came up with, excuse me. If it happened to be a 32, you'll go across the bottom x-axis, assertiveness, to the 32, and then you'll go up. And let's say that it was also a 32, you'll land in the quadrant for what's called driver. There's analytical, amiable, and expressive. And this is a really quick and dirty way. Again, this is not saying this is perfect, but for the amount of time, it may help you understand how you might be processing and perceiving information. Once you have that category, you can then compare it to this, and this gives you some basic social style attributes. If you weren't analytical, you probably knew some of this. You're thorough, serious, factual, methodical, dependable. And this might help you with a particular lens to know that this is how you initially will process. This doesn't mean that you don't have to process like the other 3. What it really does is it provides an awareness that these are probably other ways that you need to work on. Maybe you need to kind of think about things in a driver, expressive, or amiable way if you would like to process holistically all the information and really understand these concepts extensively, as well as be able to communicate them. Now, the very last thing, I ask you to think about what this term meant to you early on. You may want to pause this and reflect and think, well, I thought this, and now I kind of think this. This has been super brief, so there's not a lot of growth, but hopefully some of this will linger. You can refer to it later, and you can think about what this might mean for your day-to-day and ultimately your continual education throughout your life. If you have any questions, I'm happy to chat, happy to work with you again. Feel free to send me an email if you want to discuss this, and I'll be glad to talk. Best of luck. Thank you, and take care.